Well, hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining today. Like Wendy said, today we are talking all about how to add sponsor value to your organization's virtual event. This is a topic that I've heard association professionals talking about and asking about a lot over the past few weeks, and rightfully so. I mean, this is uncharted territory for a lot of us. So with COVID, obviously, we have all kind of had to pivot a little. You've had to take your in-person event virtual, or you are in the process of having to take it virtual. And pivot seems to be the word of 2020. You're probably sick of hearing it. I'm a little sick of hearing it, but it does make me think of this Friends episode every time I hear it. And I hope that you've seen this episode because it's hilarious. But either way, you're having to pivot. And with planning a virtual event, it comes with its own unique set of challenges that you may have not had with an in-person event. And among those challenges are sponsor relations and sponsorship packages. And how do you go about creating those in a way that's going to be just as valuable as your more traditional offerings that you offer at an on-site event? The good news is there actually are several things you can do, and there are several ways that you can add sponsor value to your organization's virtual event. So what we're going to do today is we'll talk about a couple tactics that you can implement leading up to your event to add sponsor value, but we'll really focus on tactics that you can use during your event. Now, you'll notice that we won't really touch on post-event tactics, but that's really only because a lot of those will remain very similar to what you currently do. So sending out the attendee list, for example. So we'll talk a little bit about pre-event tactics, but we'll really hone in on what you can do during your event. So pre-event tactics. This first one goes without saying. I know you all know this, but I still felt like I needed to include it. Leading up to your event, be sure to include sponsor logos in all of your promotional content. So your event registration page, your website landing page, if you have one before someone goes to the registration page, your emails. It should be at the footer of every promo email that goes out. If you are sending a newsletter that mentions it, try and include your sponsor logos in that as well. And when and where it makes sense, try hyperlinking those logos back to the organization's website. Next, give individual sponsor shoutouts on social media. Often I will see organizations tagging all of their sponsors in one post. They'll say, huge thanks to our sponsors, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and they'll tag them all. And that's great. It's really good to acknowledge your sponsors on social media, but it's not quite as effective as it might be, or I should say, not quite as valuable for your sponsors as it could be by separating those posts. Because there are a couple reasons for that. First of all, when you tag a bunch of companies together like that, or several pages, they all show up in blue, a little blue hyperlink, and whoever follows your page, sometimes they just skim over that without reading. It's not very reader friendly. And so that doesn't really do your sponsors much good if people aren't reading those posts. Second of all, by individualizing your post, by doing separate posts for each of your sponsors, that allows you to say something about each sponsor. So you can include their value prop in that post. And you can also link directly to their website and include a thumbnail image of their logo, for example. So you can add more value that way. And also, your sponsors are much more likely to engage with a post that pretty much focuses on them entirely. They're more likely to comment on it. They're more likely to share it. If you have a post that mentions all of your sponsors, they may not be quite as inclined to retweet it or share it. just because the focus isn't really on them. And also, depending on who your sponsors are, some of their competitors might be in that too. So just as a way to really add value, try and make a plan to have posts for each of your sponsors. And if you have sponsorship levels, then you can obviously post more about those who are at those higher tiers. And then last, for pre-event tactics, allow speakers to publish a guest post on your blog. Now, this is operating under the assumption that your organization has a blog. If you don't have one, I highly encourage you to consider creating one, especially during this time. People are hungry for information, and your posts do not have to be long. They just have to be valuable. That's it. So that aside, that's a whole separate webinar. But if you have a blog, that's a great platform for sponsorship value. So you can let your sponsors know leading up to the event, they're allowed to publish one guest post on your blog, or maybe it's a post before and a post after. Now, if you have had your blog for a while, what's great about this is you have metrics. So with a blog, you pretty much can tell what your average post views are, what your subscription list, how big your subscription list is, how many clicks your average blog post gets. You can pull all of that, which allows you to really quantify the value of this offering. So that's a unique advantage for this. If you do this though, I would encourage you to encourage your sponsors to write a more thought leadership post as opposed to anything too salesy. The metrics that, or the performance of that post is going to be much better than a post that is just very salesy. So whatever their area of expertise is, encourage them to put together a couple best practices for your audience. And then of course at the bottom, they can always link back to their organization's website. And then going off of this, taking it a step further, you can let them know that once the post is live, you will send an email out to your members, you will include it in your organization's newsletter, and you'll also share it on all of your social media platforms. And so that's just getting more out of this one tactic and this one content piece. So those are a couple ideas for adding sponsor value leading up to your event. But like I said, we're really going to focus on adding sponsor value during your event, because this is really what's the most different from what you're probably used to. You can't necessarily do a lot of those in-person tactics in a virtual environment. So what can you do instead? And like I said, the good news is there actually are several things you can do. So first, display sponsor logos on one or several key slides. So at the beginning of your event, whatever type of event it is, you'll likely have some welcome remarks, a general introduction of some sort. And among those slides, you should definitely have a slide that has all of your sponsor logos. And you should take a moment to recognize your sponsors right there in the beginning. Same thing goes when you're closing out your event. When you are making your closing remarks, have that slide appear again and thank your sponsors again. That said, this is also an opportunity where you can play around with sponsorship levels. So all of your sponsors should be featured on a general slide. But aside from that, you could potentially, let's say you have a title sponsorship or a premier sponsorship. You could offer that premier sponsor the opportunity to have their logo in, say, the bottom left corner of every slide of the keynote presentation. And you could just coordinate with your keynote speaker, letting them know that this logo either needs to go in their template or your template, depending on if you have a template or not. But that's an opportunity to add value. Next, give your sponsors shout outs. So we already talked about mentioning them in the beginning, thanking them at the end, but it's also important to weave that in throughout the day or however long your event lasts. So when you are, let's say you have back-to-back sessions, let's say this is a conference that is virtual. After each session, when you're making your outro for your speakers, you should have a speaker intro and then an outro. In your outro, thank your sponsors. That's a good opportunity too. And if you can give your attendees a little information as to where they can learn more or get more information, that's a bonus. You know, rather than just saying thank you to our sponsors, you could say something like, huge thank you to our sponsors. To learn more about them, visit, and maybe it is a landing page on your website that lists all of your sponsors, a little bit about them, and then has key contact information. Or if you have a virtual expo hall, which we will talk about in just a minute, you could direct people there, but let people know how they can get more information about your sponsors. Next, let your sponsors introduce your speakers. So this is a great opportunity for your sponsors to say a couple things about themselves and their company, and it allows them to get, you know, their face and name in front of people. This is, again, another opportunity that you can kind of play around with sponsorship levels, because let's say all of your sponsors get to introduce a speaker, but your premier sponsor gets to introduce the keynote speaker, and they also get to have a couple slides of their own. So going back to those opening remarks, let's say you have a couple slides. Among those slides are all of the sponsor logos. You then pass it over to your title sponsor to say a couple words, and they would have one or two slides of their own. And then the title sponsor could introduce the keynote speaker. So that's extra value that not all of the other sponsors would necessarily get. Now, I do want to point out though, with a virtual event, it's important to treat your sponsors like speakers. So prior to your event, you should absolutely schedule time to have a tech run through with your speakers to make sure that they're comfortable with the technology you'll be using that day. They know exactly how to pull up their presentation, go forward, backward, all of that. Same thing goes for your sponsors though, because if your sponsors are introducing your speakers, they're going to have to use the technology in the same way that your speakers would. Yes, they're talking for a shorter amount of time, they are still technically speakers. So when you are planning those run-throughs, be sure to include your sponsors in that as well. Next, take advantage of breaks. So often when you're putting together your agenda, you kind of view breaks as just that, a break, and you really focus more on the content and what's happening during the day, not so much those breaks. But those breaks are a prime opportunity to add sponsor value. So be mindful of what's happening during that time, even if it's 10 minutes. So what are attendees seeing on their screen? What are they hearing? What are you hoping they're doing in that time? Yes, you'll have a bunch of people getting up, going to get coffee. You'll have several people checking their email, but there will also be several people who are kind of just hanging around, or who would hang around as long as there's something for them to do. So be thoughtful of what's happening during these breaks. A couple things you could do are, you could have a legit commercial break. You could have your sponsors come on during that time in full video form and say a few words about their company or organization. Or you could have slides kind of in rotation, and the slides could have information about a number of things. Maybe you're mentioning other upcoming events that you have. Maybe another slide has the hashtag for the event. And then another slide could feature your sponsors. And again, that could just be playing on rotation in between your sessions. If you have a virtual expo hall, you could also encourage people to go check that out during this time. But again, use those breaks to your advantage and your sponsors' advantage. Now, the virtual expo hall. This is something that you've probably heard thrown out a few times in the past month. People are talking about it. It's a newer concept. But what does that actually look like? How do you actually execute a virtual expo hall? There are a number of ways. So I will point to an example. MemberClicks just hosted a one-day virtual event a couple weeks ago. It was called MC Thrive. And I figured I would just show you how we did it as one example. But here, okay, so here you see this was MC Thrive. And to give you a little background, we used Crowdcast for the live streaming component of the event. And we used MC LMS, which is our learning management system, to house everything else. So what you're looking at is MC LMS. And within that, you can create a number of rooms, so to speak. That's what these boxes are. And so in one room, you could see all your morning sessions, your afternoon sessions. But you'll notice here at the end, we had a room for a virtual marketplace. And during breaks, we would direct people. We would thank our sponsors and we would encourage people to go visit our sponsors' booths in the virtual marketplace. And this is what we were referring to. And so when you click on that, these are the booths. And so we had all of our sponsors listed here. These are just a couple. But once you clicked on the booth, then you would see information about each sponsor. So we included their logo, a brief description of who their company was. We asked each sponsor prior to the event if they would like to offer any kind of special promo to attendees. And then we included it here if they said yes. So for this particular sponsor, they said half off implementation during the national emergency. We also included a contact for each sponsor. That would essentially be the person who's standing at the booth if this were an in-person event. And we asked each sponsor to provide us with a video to make their booth a little bit more interactive. Now, what you don't see here, but it's right below the video, is a quiz. And we included a quiz for each of our sponsors. And what we did was we asked people to visit the booths and complete the quiz. And each time they completed the quiz, they would receive an additional entry into our grand prize raffle. And the grand prize was a $100 gift card and a $500 donation to the charity of their choice in their name. And so by having that, it essentially drove traffic to the booths. And again, each quiz would get you an additional entry. So that was incentive to go visit our sponsors. And the quiz, this is what it looked like on the back end. So as an administrator, but I just wanted to show you the questions. We kept these really short. They were all 4 questions, but we got these questions from our sponsors. We asked them to provide us with a couple questions, and these were questions that they wanted attendees to leave knowing about their company or organization. So for example, our title sponsor, Payrock, the first question here is, do your members need to accept credit cards? That's something that Payrock wants people to know. So these quizzes were valuable for them. But what's really important is this 4th question. And this 4th question appeared on all the quizzes. And it was, would you like Payrock, or whoever the sponsor was, to follow up directly with you? If so, please provide the best phone number and email address. And that was how we helped our sponsors drive leads. And so at the end of the event, each sponsor had about 8 to 10 leads from these quizzes. So they had people who were raising their hand saying, I want a salesperson to follow up with me. And that's valuable right there. So this quiz was very meaningful, but again, we needed to have that giveaway to really give people an incentive to take those quizzes. I'll show you what this looked like on the front end because it was a lot nicer looking. But here, you can just see the first question. Do your members need to accept credit cards? Now, I will say, if you do this, definitely keep your quizzes short, just because that fourth question is the most important, and you want to make sure people actually get to that question. So again, the point here is to drive people to the booths, give them a way to kind of interact with the sponsor, and also potentially help the sponsor drive leads. So that is what our virtual expo hall looked like. But again, there are a number of ways you can do that. The point is, though, that is kind of the virtual version of your more traditional trade show floor. Next, involve your sponsors in fun, interactive games. So hopefully, if your event is several hours or even a couple days, I've seen a few organizations have 2-day virtual events. Hopefully you have some activities, some interactive activities built in within the actual content of the event. And when you have activities like that, that is when your attendees are likely the most engaged. They're not just listening to someone speak, they're actually hopefully doing something. And so you want to make sure that your sponsors get in on that too. You don't want to exclude them from that. So a few ideas for activities. Again, I'm going to use MC Thrive as an example just because that's fresh on my mind. And we got good feedback too, so hopefully it would work for your association as well. But during the event, we took a break right before lunch and we played a short game of trivia. And I mean short, it was 5 minutes maybe, but we did a few things to involve our sponsors here. First, the winner of trivia would get a $25 gift card provided by one of our sponsors. So that was one way we were getting their name out there. Second, we asked all of our sponsors and speakers to provide us with a fun fact prior to the event. And then we turned those fun facts into trivia questions. So every question during the game of trivia had to do with our sponsors or our speakers. This one is, how many Twitter followers does High Road Solutions have? You know, just general kind of fun question. For our speakers, we had one that said, this person has seen Ozzy Osbourne 13 times, not including the 3 times he saw them with Black Sabbath. And so these were just fun games, fun trivia questions to get to know our sponsors and our speakers a little bit better. Now, we used Kahoot, is the name of the platform, to launch this trivia game. I believe at its most basic level, Kahoot is free. If you want some of the more complex features that come with it, I think there is a fee for that. But at its most basic level, it is free. But what was really cool about this was, as you were playing, after each question and after the answer was revealed, you could see the current player rankings in real time. And it started off where we had the same person in first place for the first couple of questions. And then all of a sudden, question number 4 rolled around and we had someone scoot in and take that person's place. And the chat box was just going crazy during this time. People were getting really competitive, really into it. And so this was actually a great way to engage our audience. And that's hard to do sometimes at an in-person event. It's especially hard to do on a virtual event. You know, how do you really make it engaging? And this was a great way. People got into this and they were just chit-chatting away on the side. So that is one option. Another option, as far as getting your sponsors involved in some of these fun activities, we had a social media contest. So we took another break later in the day. And during that time, we really pushed a social media contest. And we basically just said, let us know what makes you thrive, what makes you really get up and want to get going, what motivates you. Post it on Twitter and tag us using the hashtag MCThrive. And we got a number of submissions. Now, I've been managing MemberClicks's social media for, 5 years maybe, and this was probably the most engagement from one initiative that I've seen since I've been at MemberClicks. And I think a big part of that had to do with the fact that people were already at their computer, they had their phones right next to them, and so pulling a picture from their phone and tweeting it, or pulling it off their computer and posting it, was easy. And so we got a number of submissions. We got tons of dog pictures, tons of kid pictures. It was the best contest because I loved going through these pictures. But you can see here, walking my dog is the new lunch break and helps me thrive. Working with my members and allies to advocate for change for families and children. Taking midday breaks for sandcastle building makes me thrive. So this was a way that, again, we could engage with our audience and make this virtual event more interactive for attendees. The winner of the social media contest would get a gift card provided by one of our sponsors. But also, we encouraged our sponsors to get on Twitter while this was happening and engage with people. So post what makes them thrive. Now, they weren't in it to win, they weren't competing, but it was a great way for them to interact with attendees on a more personal level too, by sharing a picture of their dog. And so that actually ended up being really successful. And what we did was, that break took place at about 3-ish, and the event ended at 5. And so in between those two time periods, we created a quick PowerPoint slide that pulled the tweet of the winner, and we put her name on it. And she really appreciated that because there she was on a PowerPoint slide in real time. And so again, great way to engage your sponsors, but also great way to engage attendees. Now, just a couple other ideas here. Create and distribute virtual swag bags. Now, you probably don't think of swag bags when you think of a virtual event. That is probably the last thing you think of. But conceptually, you can still do the same thing. Now, with a swag bag in person, sometimes a lot of sponsors will include a one-pager or a pamphlet or something like that, just informative. I wouldn't recommend that you do that for a virtual event, simply because those brochures or flyers would more than likely be in PDF form. And realistically, that's just not something that your attendees are probably going to go through and click on. So to make these swag bags fun and valuable for your attendees, I would encourage you to ask your sponsors to provide some kind of special or coupon or something like that. Maybe it's a percentage off something, maybe it is a free trial of something, or if your sponsors offer education of any type, maybe it's a free course. It all depends on who your sponsors are and what they offer. But you could have this, you could almost compile those coupons or offers, and you could put them on a one-page flyer, And you could almost think of it like the coupon booklets that you get in the mail where it's just coupons on one page. You could kind of organize that yourself and send that to your attendees. You could send it the morning of your event. So you could say, you know, your swag bag is delivered, check out your goodies, and we'll see you in an hour. And that's kind of a way to get them excited for the event. Or you could give them access to it when the event starts. It's completely up to you. But the point is, you can say, you know, go through your swag bag, check out those special promos, and it makes it a little bit more fun, a little bit more engaging. And last, host a VIP pre or post event gathering. Now, this is really only if you can come up with something that people would be willing to not only spend some extra time attending, but also potentially pay a little bit more for. So if you had a VIP happy hour or something like that, then maybe that ticket or that registration fee is $5 or $10 more. But it needs to be something that people would actually want to attend. And a couple ideas are, you could potentially have your keynote speaker. You could limit the size of the post-event gathering, and you could potentially have your keynote speaker hop on in video. You could have almost like a Zoom meeting where your attendees can talk as a group, as a small group, with your keynote speaker. Or you could have all of your speakers, depending on how many you have, and they could all answer questions at the end of the day following all of the events. So that would be an opportunity for associations to for your members to not only meet the speakers, but also to ask any follow-up questions that they had. And if that's an additional $5, an additional $10, people would probably pay that. And then that just presents another event, micro event, that you could then offer to one of your sponsors. So those are the primary tactics that I will throw out. Again, I won't touch on the post-event tactics simply because many of those will be similar to what you are already familiar with. But there are a few final remarks that I kind of want to throw out. The first one is, all of your sponsors are different and they all have different needs now more than ever. So this is not the time to try and experiment with a one-size-fits-all sponsorship opportunity. Talk to your sponsors in advance of the event. Ask them what their biggest challenges are, what they're trying to achieve, and then from there, you can figure out how within your event, which of those opportunities makes the most sense for that sponsor. Another thing I want to mention is a lot of what you can provide your sponsors or what you can offer your sponsors is affected by the technology that you have. So for example, certain platforms allow you to do certain things. With some platforms, you can have pop-ups that happen while the live streaming is going on. So as the speaker is talking, there could be little pop-ups on the side. And that's kind of the equivalent of signage at an in-person event. Other platforms don't have that. Another example is if you have a virtual expo hall, some platforms allow you to have chat boxes. So you could actually have a representative in the booth of your virtual expo hall actually talking to attendees, answering questions and things like that. Other platforms don't have that. The only reason I bring this up is because it's important that prior to selecting technology to host your virtual event, that you have a general idea of what you would like to offer your sponsors, or at least options for what you can offer your sponsors, because the last thing you want is to get locked into a contract where you then find out that all of these ideas that you had, you can't actually execute. And then you're really limited in terms of what you can actually offer your sponsors. So just before you select your technology, have a list of what you would like to offer your sponsors and ask those during that sales process. I will also mention that, you know, every industry is different, and there are some industries that have very tight restrictions on what can be done during actual classes, especially if the class is for CAE or CU credit. The medical industry is one of those industries. There are some restrictions where you can't have any kind of promotional content in anything that involves CU credit. So if your organization falls into that category, then my recommendation for you would be to really focus on those pre and post event tactics. You may not be able to do a lot during the event, given those restrictions, but that's not to say that you can't do a lot before and after. And I'll just give you an example too. Another after tactic, if your organization falls into that category and you can't offer anything promotional during the actual course, one thing you could do is you could put together key takeaways from the event and turn it into a white paper, so to speak. And that could be co-branded with one of your sponsors that you then provide following the event. And maybe you provide it free to everyone who attended the event, but then you gate it for prospects so that you can actually drive more leads to your website. But not only that, you are also just making people more aware of the sponsor that co-branded that white paper. So just another option. But again, for you, those pre and post event tactics are going to be the most important. And the last thing I'll say is just when you're planning a virtual event, you can't replicate the in-person experience. And I think a lot of people go into it and they're really trying to do just that. They are trying to take everything that they do in a in-person environment and they're trying to do it in a virtual environment. And you can't really do that. But having a virtual environment gives you new opportunities. There are new things that you can do that you couldn't do at an in-person event. So go into it with the mindset that you're not trying to replicate that. You're trying to create something new. So this is an opportunity to get creative and, again, leverage the technology that you're using, because there are going to be a lot of features in there that can really help you out in this regard. So with that said, though, I would love to hear any questions. If you have them, I'd love to answer those. Also, if anyone has any examples of anything that you've done personally to build sponsorship packages for a virtual event, or if you've seen anything really cool, I would love to hear about it, and I'm sure others would too. So with that said, are there any questions?
Hello, it's Wendy again.
Hi.
Let's start with some questions from the chat.
Okay.
One of the first ones that really caught my attention is, how do you balance tailoring that sponsor recognition to the best option for each sponsor, but also keep a level playing field? So no sponsor feels that someone at their same dollar amount received more recognition than someone else. And I think that really goes back to your point about asking sponsors what they want.
Mm-hmm.
So Callie, how would you approach that?
Yeah, there is a fine line between delivering on what people want, but then making sure that it is balanced between what all of your sponsors are doing. So rather than asking them what's the best way to word this, rather than asking them what, offerings specifically they would like among your virtual event. So for example, rather than asking them, would you like to have your logo on the keynote presentation? Would you like to have a commercial break? Rather than asking them that or presenting them with those options, I would ask them what their goal is or what their pain point is. And then from there, the ball is kind of in your court as to what you can offer them. And I would just be mindful as you're doing that to make sure that it is somewhat of a fair playing field for what each sponsor is paying. And then you could even say that to your sponsors too. If you could let them know that we are customizing our sponsorship packages, that's because we want to make sure that each of our sponsors gets the most value out of this as they can. And so going into it, that will kind of put your sponsors' minds at ease, knowing that everyone's is going to be a little bit different, but also moving forward, if they see something that they really like that someone else did, that's something that they could then take advantage of at a future event.
That's terrific. And again, do you, Callie, or MemberClicks, have an example of a virtual swag bag? Or do we know someone on the call who might have an example of a virtual swag bag? I think there's going to be a lot of interest in that.
Yeah, so I wish I had an example. I don't. But I don't have an example from a trade show, but I do have an example from, this sounds so silly, but I recently moved, which is why I have nothing on my walls currently. But I signed on with Georgia Power, and in doing that, at the very end, as part of that, they provided me with, it felt like a swag bag. It had a bunch of different companies, and it was essentially a one pager, like I mentioned, that just had different coupons, so to speak, on it. And so, for example, there was 20% off one item at Home Depot. There was, gosh, I don't even remember, but it was basically just a bunch of different stores, and they all had their offerings on this one page. And then I also received a follow-up email with that same promo shortly after signing on with Georgia Power. So somehow in their system, they must have then provided my email to those companies. And then those companies sent me an email, again, kind of further pushing that promo. And I could envision the same thing happening with a conference. So the morning of the event or during the event or something like that, getting my swag bag and then kind of seeing the different things that people are offering.
That's terrific. And then one side conversation that's been going on that I would just wanted to point out to everybody, and then we'll open it up for other questions. We did have some questions come up about advertising versus sponsorships and using logos and contact information and linking back from websites. And so just for the group at large, before, or rather with the video and the slides, we'll also gather some attorney focused articles to link as well, just to help y'all make sure that you're not hitting UBIT if you don't want to hit UBIT. So for everyone else, thank you, Callie, so much. And we're going to go ahead and stop our recording and open it up for any other questions.